Hi, I'm Will Sullivan, your co host.
And I'm Antonina Ogruza. And you are listening to our new podcast, Let's Cover That, where we meet with healthcare providers turned tech entrepreneurs that are filling the gaps in the healthcare industry.
And today we have Dr. Brian Cohen, who is joining us for our very first podcast. So, all kidding aside, Brian, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little about yourself and your background?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Will and Anthony. I'm excited to break the glass here as the first guest. And I'm going to set the bar either really high or really low, and you know, we'll see where it goes from there. But excited to be on here with you guys. I am a practicing anesthesiologist. I've been in practice for about 15 years. I started my own anesthesia company about 7 years ago here in South Florida. And around that same time, I also started working as a specialty medical director for anesthesia pain management for a medical liability company. Um, that path allowed me to sort of look at healthcare from two different angles as I continued the clinical practice, the administrative side of running the practice, and then also the risk focus world of healthcare, which really oftentimes seem to run in parallel and don't cross over until we least expect it. Um, while living in that world and moving through some of the projects in the medical liability space, I ended up meeting two of my other partners, which launched us into a separate endeavor called Adaptrack. So I'm a co-founder and chief medical officer of Adaptrack as well.
Thanks, Brian. That sounds awesome. Can you talk us through the lack of tools for the clinician and what kind of led you to Adaptrack?
Yeah, I mean, we noticed a couple things. One, as I was starting my company and in practice, and I had my partners, my employees, and we have our own little healthcare bubble, right? Um, as I'm seeing what's happening in the medical malpractice space, and I'm seeing anesthesiologists and groups apply for coverage, I'm seeing them come in with claims of coverage. And working them through those claims and looking at the trends of number one, what's triggering these claims, and of the applications we have coming in, what is their history of claims? And what you start to notice, as you guys very well know, is there are trends, and there are things that seem to just keep happening over and over and over, um, specialty by specialty, or even just in a little broader sense. And so what I would do is I'd go back to my partners. I'd say, hey guys, like, let's not do this because I keep seeing this come up in claims, and maybe we should do things this way because this seems to be a little safer. And that's great for my group, um, but it didn't really break outside that bubble. And I didn't know how to do that, until again paths crossed with the technology piece and the larger picture piece that came in with my other two partners of Sam Taggart and Niraj Swami. And that seemed to be a gap in healthcare that really wasn't being addressed. The other piece, as we started looking at, is this something that is needed out there? The glaring answer was yes, and because I felt anything was needed for clinicians. And as this was launching, that just became accelerated as we hit into kind of that 2020 year, because there were more and more tools out there for patients and for health systems or for insurances or for um, you know uh, management services. But I would say, where are all the tools for us, like for those of us that are actually taking care of the patients and running through the COVID wards and on the airway team and out there doing the work? All these tools are being built for the people around us, but I didn't see that much being done to help me and my peers and my colleagues. And that became a challenge to us. And we challenged ourselves with, if we're going to solve for something, we're going to solve for things that actually help the clinicians. And that can be a challenge in and of itself, because as you look to solve for things, oftentimes you then give somebody one more thing to do. what we wanted to do is we want to take things off of our plates. We want to make our lives easier. We want to make our lives safer. And we want the clinician walking away feeling like they just won. And when you look at it through that lens and you bring in that risk side of things, it's why don't we create a tool that essentially helps de-risk ourselves? And that can be from a couple different angles. We looked at risk from three different angles: from a clinical angle, which is exactly what it sounds like, really where the bulk of medical malpractice claims would come from. But there's also administrative risk. That's another bucket, and that's things that can drive inefficiencies within your practice or between team members or with your documentation. And then there's personal risk. And that was, again, something that maybe 5 or 10 years ago meant something totally different than it does now. Now you talk about personal risk, you can break that down even to talk about moral injury and burnout and some of the things that may be a couple degrees separated from what you and I traditionally think of as liability risk. But when you start to bring it all together, it really comes together. A burned out physician or a physician or clinician who is, morally beat down has now been shown to be more likely to end up in a medical liability claim for all the reasons that, would kind of make sense. So those are the three buckets: is the clinical, administrative, and personal. And we tried to then challenge ourselves to create a tool to help clinicians solve for those three issues.
What do you think when you talk about that, Brian? You get a few items that you want to go solve, and then all of a sudden you add another one, another bucket shows up as you kind of progress in your discussion. You kind of look at a couple, monumental marks in the healthcare, industry. You look at the IOMs, to err is human over a couple decades ago. Then you look at the ACA and the triple aim of access, quality of care, cost containment. And when you look at each of those, they're two big aspects, but now we're still in 2022, over 2 decades since IOM's report on that, of these near misses and unnecessary incidents. And then you also look at the ACA now 12 years in, and now we're finally evolving to the point of understanding, hey, we have to start looking at this other problem we have, which is from a clinician standpoint, not patient centered care necessarily, because it does impact that, not just necessarily quality, but why do you think it's evolved or taken this long to evolve that way?
Um, I mean, it's a slow move. Everything in healthcare, when you look at it as a system level, is just such a slow moving train, because there are so many pieces and players involved with it. But I think to answer your question is going back to something we felt strongly about. It it never was really taken directly to that clinician. A lot of these programs that were developed were all developed around the clinicians, and um, you really have to start thinking about how do we learn, and how do we best actually take information, internalize that information, and turn that into action. And we're a weird bunch of people. We're a unique bunch of people in a sense of, we are highly focused, highly determined, highly driven, but always moving. And I'm not going to sit there too often in front of 50 PowerPoint slides or 4-hour lectures, and take in this massive shift in mentality and say, okay, now go do this. That's, get inside of our heads. We learn in micro moments, right? We want to digest information in very quick ways that are impactful to us and how we provide our care and how we act in our practice. And we're going to keep moving because we got 20 more patients in there that need to be taken care of. And so, I think part of that is what we experimented with, Will, to see if at least this theory was right. What was the difference between how we've been learning and how we've been presented information on risk and change versus maybe how we would propose to do it now. And that's what we did partly with Adaptrack, is break that up into as many tiny little micro learnings as possible. We don't need to be presented 6,000 words to create change. We actually want to be presented about 40 or 20 words that are impactful that say, hey, we noticed when you do this, this happens this amount of time. Okay, that's helpful. I'm not going to do that anymore. And kind of creating that habit loop of allowing the clinicians to digest that information in a way that's more natural to them. We force them to reflect on that. They apply that newly learned knowledge, and they get a reward for it, which is our reward is a CME credit. And this feedback loop of how the clinicians are engaging with this type of risk information, which, I mean, as much as the three of us like talking about risk information, most people don't, find it too exciting. So it's presenting it in ways that make it relevant to us and make it digestible and make it current. And in order to do that, we try to pull in more and more data points that make it more and more relevant and more current, meaning, I've signed up with my NPI number. Okay, well, now I know my specialty. I'm getting anesthesia related content. I'm not learning about the most common errors that the oncologists are making that are leading to claims. And I think all those reasons will kind of lead to the answer to that question. It's bring it to me and how I'm going to learn about this, and then watch me take action. And I think that, when I say we experimented with that, and now that we've had kind of those years behind it, I think we've been very satisfied with the success in which we're seeing clinicians choose to learn this way as opposed to kind of the old school manner.
Sure. So, it's interesting because, from your profession and everybody in healthcare, they're service oriented first and foremost. And, you kind of see as you guys are the last ones to kind of evolve in the holistic answer for how do we get better patient care. But it's actually taking care of our clinicians, de-risking them, making them feel good about what they do, like it's a win every single time, and actually meeting them in, come like a William Wordsworth kind of comment, like spots of time, like finding them. That's poetically, like that's how he wrote, and it's kind of finding clinicians in the same fashion, which I think is really incredible.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and it's finding us when we're ready to engage with that information, and that's the other portion of Adaptrack that we everything is opt-in. We try not to force it at a time when it's not right for you. You're coming to this when it's the right time and the right place and the relevant scenario. Um, and you're right that if a clinician is de-risking him or herself, by definition, the patient is receiving better care, safer care, better outcomes. I mean, that's what risk is. It's not risk that I'm going to hurt myself at work. It's the risk is that the patient is not going to have a positive outcome. That's what met liability is really. And you're turning that to the physician's actions, the clinician's actions who are out there every day, rather than to the patient or to the larger system.
Brian, to your point earlier about the impact that this is already starting to make on the clinicians that are using Adaptrack, what is the feedback you're getting from your users? And are you able to measure at this time the impact that it's actually making on the industry?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is, measurable impact that we have now really sits in some of the insights that we're able to gain back from the users reflecting on the information they're engaging with. Now, what that means is, as the clinicians engage with whatever micro learnings about risk, in the clinical, administrative, or personal bucket, the way they're capturing that and showing that they have engaged is they're reflecting on it, right? They're applying that to themselves in their practice. That allows that data to really show what their actions are going to be, and what that information really did inside here, right? So, for example, if we know that, let's see, after 3 p.m. in the afternoon, there's 30% more opioid scripts written for patients prior than 3 p.m. that's not something I typically think about, but now I was just presented that in a nudge, what we call. And now I'm aware of that statistic. I'm then going to reflect on, okay, this, I can say this is interesting information I wasn't aware. I'm going to do a couple things to help prevent this in my own practice. I'm going to consider scheduling, less patients after 3 p.m. and I'm going to make a conscious effort for these later patients in the day to be aware of this trend that's been seen in healthcare. When you have that information at your fingertips now on an anonymous and aggregated level, that sort of allows us to measure impact, right? That allows us to measure that these clinicians are now hearing and understanding and internalizing these trends and all this data that our medical liability and healthcare industry has at our fingertips. It's now being internalized to the people that need it. That's been amazing to see, and it's been encouraging to see, and it's proven a point that this is how people want to learn right now. That doesn't mean that it replaces all other learning scenarios and all other types of information sharing, but it's a nice way to supplement all of our other traditional learning methods and get the information to clinicians in the way we want it. The other impact, we'll continue to see as we track through different groups of clinicians that are using the tools as they move through over time. As you and I well know, the lag time on claims from actions is, you're looking at anywhere from 18 months to call it 3 years, really, to see significant results from point A to B. So, the goal is, of course, to decrease and de-risk claims. That for us is another very personal win for clinicians. It's not just that time leading up to a claim, but the other thing we've really grown to appreciate is really that pain and suffering that a clinician goes through if a claim does happen. And that, we've talked to so many clinicians that have done a beautiful job of verbalizing their own experience. Some have lasted 10 to 12 years of going through these claims and appeals where you are beat down and it really affects your personal life, your family life, your work life, and everything it touches. So that is obviously the goal of getting this information to us before that happens. And then understanding that when and if this does happen, then more tools are needed. Then we also need to be there to support through that arena as well. So
I think it's interesting because it really humanizes the piece of like the medical malpractice, the risk mitigation. And it's not you saying, let's drop our costs and let's avoid being sued, but actually like the whole holistic humanizing of we want to bring good patient care. You want to help people get better, the positive outcomes, and overall make it better for everybody. I mean, it's not about like the business of liability necessarily, but the business of taking care of people properly. And yeah,
yeah, it's a really good point, and that's something that, again, I found this deep appreciation for that when I started working in the medical liability space and seeing black and white paper come in as an application, right? It's a name on a paper. And you start reading about claims history. And then some of the questions are, well, what have you done to change your practice since that claims history? And you start seeing those explanations. And these names on paper start to come to life. These are my peers and my colleagues, and these are people who are literally doing what we're doing every day and sacrificing part of our own lives because we're here to take care of other people. That's our job, and that's what we want to do. And, outside of a few bad eggs in this world, no one's out there trying to do something that is purposefully risky that can cause harm to another human being in the healthcare space. So how do we help each other stay out of those situations and prevent those situations? And I think we have a lot of the data and trends over the past 20 years to help each other do that. We just have to get that information into the hands of the right people in the right time and allow them to make those decisions to shift away from those risks. But it becomes very human, Will, and it becomes um, very disheartening to see when you get stuck in that process of a claim happening and just sucked into that system, what it can do to people and providers who are out there trying to do good things. And it's part of what we do. It's part that is a reality in practicing medicine. But we can do better. I think as a system, we can do better in the medical malpractice space. In That's what we're trying to do. And I think there's a lot of room now in the medical liability space for technology to start pushing some buttons and start making things happen a little bit faster. And that's where we're ready to make some noise and have some fun.
Sure. And one of the things that, just as an additional point to that, Brian, like that 20 years of expertise that you're pulling in from data is a lot on the larger entity side of the health systems, the hospitals, the physicians. But now you're starting to see that trend into new professions with, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and different, other kind of quote unquote ally classes to actually going on to the front lines to continue to grow that access to care. It almost feels like the evolution that you're finally bringing to the door, is now right as these folks are getting full practice authority in so many states, is turning into, hey, you get to turn on the lights to your business and your licensure is at a higher standard of care and need, and your risk is higher too, your responsibility. It almost feels like they're being given, kind of a head start on understanding that based on the knowledge and, over the years from you all, right?
It's that piece of this was like a huge light bulb when we started looking at trends, not only historical, but what's happening right now, which is what you just described. You have nurse practitioners and PAs, for example, who are doing just what you're doing, who are doing just what you're saying, getting out into practice in a exaggerated way from what has been done historically, meaning more involvement, which also means more exposure. So to say, as a nurse practitioner or a PA, we haven't seen that many claims over the past 20 years. You're right, you haven't. That's awesome, but you're about to. And that's not in a negative or scary way or like, Debbie Downer here, but that's just the reality because all of a sudden your exposure is completely changing. And lawyers are noticing that as well. I'm sure they are. And what you described, we also sort of had that light bulb moment when you look at, for example, the physician population in the UK with the NHS. For decades, they were highly protected, and it was a very, non-existent litigious area, over there. And then all it takes is, a couple of people with these major claims, and everyone's like, "Oh, we can sue doctors over here. This is awesome." And all of a sudden, you started seeing this trend go up. But that is what we saw in the States, 20, 30 years ago. So all of a sudden, exactly as you described, we can take all the data and all the information that we've now accumulated over the past 20, 30 years, and now it's a crystal ball. It's a crystal ball for example, the physicians in the UK or the PAs and the NPs here in the States, because we know what you're going to get sued for. It's the same as what we've been sued for the past 20 or 30 years. It just keeps repeating itself in these trends and these certain practice habits and these certain, patient habits even that can affect it. And so to get that information to these populations now is very, very powerful. And I think could really just change the entire trajectory of what you would otherwise see as the curve of claims that would come in on these personas.
Brian, the work you and your team are doing is incredibly impressive. And, we hope that anyone listening, any clinicians listening will be able to take a look at the platform and utilize it for their best interest. But tell us a little bit about next steps for Adaptrack. Where do you see the company going? And is there a certain defining moment that you think you and your team will say, wow, we really, really made a meaningful impact on the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we had to do was show that clinicians cared enough to engage, and that this was done in a way in which we wanted to engage with it. And that now that that has been proven, I think now what we can do is limitless, because an engaged clinician is one that really can accomplish almost anything. So what does that mean? That means we're going to make some noise in the medical liability space, and we're looking for, companies, organizations that care about the same things. They care about their clinicians, and they care about de-risking them, and they care about finding ways to support them that not only lead to short-term success, but long-term survival of their career. And as we continue to use Adaptrack as a tool to do that, not only de-risk but start really advancing what we as an industry can do in medical liability to continue to be there for the clinicians. That's why we exist as companies, is to protect us. And so any companies out there that want to join in and kind of join that mission, that's what we're here to do.
Incredible. Well, Brian, we are super impressed and appreciative of all the work you're doing at Adaptrack, and that's hopefully the best podcast we'll have on Let's Cover That. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Will and Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in to our first episode of Let's Cover That.